Hello, my name's Ajay Ryan. You're watching The Defining Moment for Creating the Culture of Conscience. Today we're very happy to welcome Dr. Saul Zadka. Dr. Zadka was born in Jerusalem, and as a journalist he was also a foreign correspondent in the UK for over 10 years. He's also a television commentator and also a press reviewer for the BBC. And as a lecturer he was the head of the largest media department in Israel. Dr. Zadka, thank you so much for joining us on The Defining Moment.
Hello, Ajay.
Well, today's topic is about, can the media stop the conflicts in the Middle East? And obviously that's a subject you have direct first-hand experience of. What I'd like to ask you first of all, though, is can you please share with us a defining moment from your life?
My defining moment, maybe more than one, are associated, unfortunately, with wars. I was born in Jerusalem, and I remember the time when, as a little school child, I was informed during the Six-Day War in 1967 about the liberation of Jerusalem, about the fact that Jerusalem would no longer be divided. And I remember my first visit to the eastern part of Jerusalem, where the old Jewish holy places were located. And I was quite emotional about it at the time, and I still remember it as a very fine, defining moment. In 2002, in the height of the suicide bombing in Israel and Israeli military reprisals, I witnessed a situation in which Arab students and Jewish students did not speak to each other. I led a multicultural department. I had 700 students. 25% of them were Arabs, Israeli Arab. When I entered the class, I noticed straight away, and this is really one of the secondary defining moments that I remember, that on my first day there, I entered the class and I saw straight away that the Jews sit in one side of the class and the Arabs sit on the other. And for me, this was something unacceptable. And I encouraged them to talk about it. They were very reluctant at the time. And the best they could tell me was that they just say good morning to each other, but they don't even engage in the cafeteria of the campus.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Dr. Zadka. Well, let's move on to the topic today. Can the media stop the conflicts in the Middle East? Often when we think about the Middle East, it's somehow one big conflict. But as someone from the media, can you tell us what are actually the details of that conflict? Is it just the one, or are there many?
No, it's not one. The Middle East is full of conflicts, but when we talk about the conflict in the Middle East, we mean the Israeli-Arab conflict. It has been reduced lately into the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but it's not necessarily the heart of the conflict, although many Western politicians are tempted to say once the Israeli-Arab conflict is resolved, all the other conflicts will be automatically resolved. And this is unfortunately not the case, because I can't see the relation between the current situation in Iraq and the Israeli-Arab conflict. But we have to bear in mind not only that historic conflict, which, as you know, has started more than 100 years ago, but the civil wars which are currently taking place in various parts of the Middle East. There used to be a civil war in Lebanon for 10 years. The Palestinians are on the verge of a kind of a civil war. Iraq is practically in a state of a civil war. There was a very, very bloody war between Iraq and Iran between the years 1980 and 1988. There was the invasion of the Iraqis into Kuwait in 1990. And of course the current situation in and around Iraq. We are talking about the fact that at any given time almost half of the Middle East countries were involved in this kind or another of wars or low intensity conflicts. And unfortunately this is the situation now. Of course we are tempted to think that once the Israeli-Arab conflict is resolved, all the other conflicts would follow it. I can't see it happening. However, the main source of tension might disappear. However, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not very bloody in terms of casualties. You can see that in one given day, sadly enough, in Iraq, more people are getting killed than during one whole year between the Israelis and the Palestinians. I know that you can't measure everything by casualties, But certainly the intensity of the war in Iraq overshadows what is happening along the Israeli-Palestinian divide.
So you don't prescribe to this school of thought that says that once you bring peace to Jerusalem, peace will come to the rest of the world?
Unfortunately not, because there are certain areas of friction in which Arab countries are caught, like border disputes, like domestic unrest, like personal tensions between various leaders. Sure enough, it would be fair to say that once the conflict between the Israelis and the Arabs is solved and bloodshed is no longer the order of the day, a great deal of burden would be removed from the back of the Middle East, but conflicts would continue to happen.
Dr. Zadka, when we hear about what's actually going on in the Middle East, it's often through the filter of our own media, the BBC or Sky or perhaps even CNN or more recently Al Jazeera, but we don't seem to hear anything from the actual local media in Israel or in Palestine. Can you tell us why is that the case?
Well, naturally, we are fed by the reports that the international foreign media is providing us with, and we don't know exactly how events and processes on the ground are being reported by the local media, because we don't happen to read the local media. And I say it with a relative sadness, because if we happen to read even translations of what is printed or broadcast on Arab and Israeli media outlets, we would have a greater understanding of the conflict. We might even conclude that the conflict is not at all unsolvable. We might be able even to understand that on a daily basis, these people are not in the business of killing each other all the time. They live side by side, they do business together, and they share even a common ground. Because don't forget, the foreign media naturally, and I don't blame it for that, are reporting about the highlights. The highlights consist of bad news. Bad news in the Middle East today is massacres, suicide bombings,
the sensational
reprisals,
headlines,
retaliations. The sensational negative aspect of the Middle East is often aired by the international media. But this is not necessarily the case when it comes to the local media.
And is there this local good news media that...
Not necessarily. They are reporting plenty of bad news, but it's more domestic. But sometimes they report about daily life. Sometimes they report about what the two conflicting communities have in common. It's not that this is a very positive media. On the contrary, it's still the mirror image of a very dire and sad situation on the ground. However, when you get yourself familiar with the broad picture, you can see that in between the shadows there are also a few rays of light.
Now, recently a BBC correspondent has been kidnapped in Gaza, and so in that sense in that case the BBC have actually become the news themselves. But do you see it nevertheless as being important that there are foreign correspondents in Gaza or in Israel or in Palestine to report the news?
Absolutely important, because the presence of foreign correspondents on this kind of flashpoints is very vital. Not only that the people from the outside would know what is happening, it is also has some kind of a moderating effect. I know that this is not new, that journalists are being kidnapped in Gaza, and Iraq became the most dangerous place for foreign correspondents to be in, not only for foreign correspondents, but also for local journalists. But we have to have these foreign witnesses, because sometimes you need the presence of the foreign correspondent in such a place where the media is very much gagged by the authorities. And it's a pity that in Gaza, where the BBC correspondent might be maybe the only foreign correspondent who actually lives in the Strip, has been kidnapped. And it became a daily occurrence in the Middle East, unfortunately. But at the same time, we have to look at the bright side. And the bright side is that journalists are still important, otherwise they would not be kidnapped.
Well, let's take an even closer look at the situation in Jerusalem, in Israel, and in Palestine. Do the journalists there, like the journalists from Israel and from Palestine, do they ever have dialogue? Do they ever have forums in which they can meet and actually exchange what really is the story and what really needs to be told?
A handful of them are in constant touch with each other all the time, even on a daily basis. On the basis of exchanging information, one needs the other, and then political differences disappear, of course. But I would say that as a whole, most of the journalists on both sides are not in contact with each other. In the past, I was involved in a kind of a network which tried to narrow the gap between those two groups of journalists for the sake of the community and the future of the region. But on a daily basis, only those who write about Palestinian affairs are in touch in Israel with Palestinian colleagues.
And so other journalists, they report the news, would you say, from a biased point of view, or are they still trying to report an objective analysis of events from that day or as things are unfolding?
Unfortunately,
I mean, those who are not in touch with the other side, so to speak.
Yeah. Unfortunately, in the Arab world, the journalists are expected to serve the national interest of the state. It is slightly different when the journalist is working for a private media outlet, but this is not so, unfortunately. That means really that sometimes in certain countries in the Middle East, you are first and foremost the patriot, and then the journalist. You would never, as a patriot, break a story which would harm the national interest of the state. You would never break a story which would expose corruption in high places, because you would be harmed, not necessarily physically, although this happened as well, but your integrity would be jeopardized, and you can lose your job very, very quickly. So in this sense, you still see there is a lack of parity between journalists who are working in a free society and those who are working in the open society. And this is, by the way, why so many of the Arab newspapers have moved 20 years ago to London. And London, paradoxically, during the last 2 decades, became the most important media city for the Arab countries, because here they have a free environment and they are very much far away physically from those regimes that can harm them. So in a way, I would say that if one wants to get a good picture of what is happening in a certain Arab country, he can't get it out of reading a local newspaper only. He has to be acquainted with the Arab television satellite networks, with the foreign media, and with plenty of internet websites.
However, earlier what you're saying is that the media is not free in the Middle East to actually take on this role, to take on the challenge of trying to resolve conflicts that are going on there. They're actually, their hands are tied.
Absolutely. Most of the media outlets in the Middle East are owned by the governments. Take, for instance, Egypt, the most important and biggest Arab country in the Middle East. You have more than 70 million people there, and the three most important newspapers, which are read by a relatively wide audience, are all owned by the government, and you would not be able to see any newspaper in Egypt which would deviate from the official line of the regime. So they would not necessarily tell you the truth, but sometimes they can create an environment of peace, coexistence, and moderation, which would also serve the interest of the government.
So is there, for example, a kind of Rupert Murdoch figure in the Middle East, someone who's a media mogul?
There isn't. And I say it with regret, although automatically when you hear the phrase media mogul, you think about it in disdain, because how many people in this country love Rupert Murdoch? He is not loved even in his homeland, in Australia or across the Atlantic. But sometimes I think that in the non-democratic world, the emergence of a media mogul could do only good to the country's democracy and freedom of expression, because the media tycoon would accumulate certain strength which would balance the influence that the media on regime might have. And we can see in the past from other examples, like in South America during the 80s, that media moguls used their power in order to pressurize the regime to democratize their countries, because they needed to work in an environment of freedom of expression. And that's why I think if we have a few moguls in the Arab world, the situation would be slightly better, because then the media would be controlled by two conflicting forces. And by doing so, they will create also a kind of a competition. At the moment, the only media mogul that I can think of was the former Prime Minister of Lebanon, Rafik Hariri, who has been assassinated. He was not only a media mogul, he was also a Prime Minister. And one has balanced the other. Of course, it's not a healthy situation, but at least in Lebanon, he could have been a media mogul, because the media in Lebanon is relatively free, mainly because it's privately owned.
So he was like a kind of a Berlusconi figure of the Middle East.
Yes, but of course he used his own media outlets to promote his self-interest, yes. But he was also a Lebanese patriot, and many people regard him as the father of modern Lebanon, the one who championed the reconstruction of Lebanon after so many years of a civil war.
And nevertheless, someone of his stature, his power, was assassinated.
Although not because of his immediate power, but because of his political aspiration. But in a country such as Egypt, if we go back to Egypt, a media mogul would not be even possible, because the government would not let such a figure to exist.
So we have this situation, the local media are not free, there's no media mogul there to kind of try and compete with the regimes who are already there trying to impose their perspective or their particular kind of dogma on the people. So what hope is there really for the media to actually take on and be successful in creating a peaceful society?
And that is the problem, because most of the regimes in the Middle East are totalitarian. We can't pin too many hopes on the local media to swim against the stream, to question the wisdom of the government's policy, for example. We can see it in Israel and to a certain extent in Lebanon. Two interesting cases, because those two countries were at war with each other last summer. And both of them might be regarded, even on Western standards, as democracies. What happened after this war? None of the conflicting sides was happy with the outcome. The Israeli government has been grilled, tormented by the media, to such an extent that it prompted the resignation of the chief of staff and a few other senior generals in the army. And now we might witness the possibility that the prime minister and the defense minister will have to go. It might happen next month. Why? Because of the power of the media in Israel, because they can write about anything they want. And they expose also plenty of corruption cases that would not be possible, unfortunately, in the Arab world. We know, for instance, that the current Israeli government is subject to police investigation. The president had to resign and leave his presidential palace because of media intrusion. This could have happened only in a democratic country, as it is happening in this country at the moment, in Britain, over the Cash for Honor scandal. Now, can you imagine the president of Syria facing the police in his own presidential palace? Of course not. And that's one of the problems why we look at the Arab media outside the Arab world, and why we pin so much hope on media outlets such as Al Jazeera.
I was going to say, what do you think of Al Jazeera?
I am very ambivalent about Al Jazeera, because on one hand, Al Jazeera represents a major breakthrough in the Arab world. Al Jazeera, ostensibly at least, is free to discuss almost any subject on the channel. Of course, I'm not allowed to criticize their own country, Qatar, because after all, it's not a private channel. At the same time, I noticed that sometimes Al Jazeera is serving the interest of certain fundamentalist, nationalistic elements within the Arab world. And I'm not talking only about giving a platform to Bin Laden on many occasions in the past. I'm talking about the volatile language that guided Al Jazeera throughout the years. They are not at all balanced, they are not at all objective or partial, and sometimes they even use too many adjectives to the subject of the report. However, compared to other Arab media outlets that are currently operating within the Arab Middle East, Al Jazeera is head and shoulder above them. But look what happened since the emergence of Al Jazeera more than 10 years ago. We have other similar outlets that want to compete with Al Jazeera. I know all of them are financed by states like Lebanon and Saudi Arabia, but they are more free to express opinions than the print media, which is owned by the Arab regimes. And that's why we can see that many of the television channels started to operate from this country, from Britain, like NBC, or that the Lebanese channels, which are regarded as the most popular channels in the Arab world, more popular than Al Jazeera, have done a lot in order to make Arab audiences more aware of what is happening around them. So there are many, many positive changes. But ask me, has Al Jazeera managed to bring people to the streets? Has Al Jazeera brought about the downfall of a certain totalitarian regime? The answer is not. However, media, if they are being activated properly, can calm down the political storm in the Middle East, can educate people to a future of coexistence. But it has to happen when it suits them. Unfortunately, the media outlets in the Middle East follow the regimes, follow the decision-making processes. They are not creating their own opinion, their own power base, because they are subjected to criticism and censorship from the regimes. But as it happened during my time when I tried to get populations of journalists, Israelis and Palestinians together, we noticed that sometimes certain kind of journalists who are powerful and opinionated, can be courageous enough in order to say, okay, the politicians are doing whatever they do, but we also have our own agenda, and our own agenda does not have to suit theirs, which means we still believe in peace, coexistence, reconciliations, and future common ground between conflicting communities, and they can act accordingly.
Well, let's move on, because as a lecturer you have also first-hand experience of working with young Arab and Jewish Israelis, and I wonder, having educated and worked with them, do you feel there is hope? Do they, as a new generation, present a hope for the future?
I told them, listen, we have to think about our future, and you know that the future cannot be one that excludes one of the groups. That's why Jews, Muslims, and Christians, all of them Israelis, all of them with Israeli citizenship, should get together to do something about it. And I could tell them, listen, I want you to sit with each other or to mix, but this was not a good idea because it would be very, very artificial and imposed from above. What I did was, in order to diffuse the tension, to use the media as an ideal tool in order to bring them together. So I did it either by establishing a radio station which advocated the notion and the principles of coexistence, and that means that everything is being done mutually. That on this radio station, musical programs would be presented by two journalists, by two students, one Arab and one Jew, and they will speak in two languages, in Hebrew and in Arabic. And they will broadcast and play Arabic and Hebrew music and Western music, just in order to make them more confident, yes, that there is a future for two communities in one place, and also that they have many, many in common, maybe not so much politically, but culturally. And also that even the religions have plenty of common because they came, after all, from the same source. So in order to break the ice, yes, I had to use certain tools. So it was the radio station which I set up. It took me about a year to do that. It was producing joint bilingual television programs which were broadcast by the local television channel. And it was the maybe the most successful project which I did in my second year as a head of a department. I selected 24 students, 12 Arabs and 12 Jews. I virtually locked them in a hotel in Nazareth, a very nearby town, for 3 weekends. And we had also weekly meetings in between all these weekends. And eventually they produced a very highly professional bilingual magazine which has been distributed all over the north of the country in 100,000 different households. And this project also won an international award in London a year later. And what people found out through this kind of project, that what they make them united is stronger than what separates them. And what I found out is that once you put this kind of people together under the same roof 24 hours, all their attitude towards each other is changing at all. Sometimes one evening, one dinner, creating social chemistry between them can break all the barriers. And that's exactly what happened. And I invested heavily in this kind of people because they are going to be the journalists of tomorrow. They are going to shape public opinions tomorrow. They are the future journalists of the Middle East, and I think that we have to invest much more in them. And this was, in a way, my, how can I say that, my drive. I wanted to do as much as I could in order to combine the media with the highly desired aim of trying to engage those two communities together. My criticism about the Israeli Jewish majority and the Arab, Muslim and Christian minority is they're not doing enough in order to bridge the gap between them. Of course, most of the initiative has to come from the majority, and the majority is not doing enough for that. And this is quite regrettable, because I think that the Israeli Arab population is an ideal population to be used as a bridgehead between Israel and the entire Arab world.
I don't understand why young people, especially if they have access to the internet, and if they're looking at the future of how they would like to see their country 5 years from now, 10 years from now, why are they just not motivated themselves to actually say, look, here's my hand, I reach it out, and I want to see a better future?
Because I'm afraid they are not confident enough. They have the drive, they have the understanding, they might even have the motivation, but I don't think that they have enough tools to do that. They think it's much bigger than them. That's why it was very important that whatever I did over there in the region has been done within a framework of the academic life. It was easier for me to do it like that. But people find it very, very difficult to act as individuals. They don't have enough hope, by the way, that things will happen overnight. Some of them live in despair. Many of them feel a kind of hopelessness, that things could really be improved just because they will take certain initiatives. So if we really want to make a sea change in the area, we have to mobilize forces with goodwill and money in order to make such a difference noticed.
Well, Dr. Zadka, I'm afraid we've run out of time. Thank you for coming in and sharing today. I really hope that the momentum that you've begun with your work can really continue to prosper and bring more and more result in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Ajay, for having me.
You've been watching The Defining Moment for Creating the Culture of Conscience. If you'd like to find out more, we're on the web at www.definingmoment.eu. Thank you for watching, and we wish you all the best.